46-year-old Thomas Montgomery was a company man. For the last 12 years, he had punched a time clock at Dynabrade Incorporated, a factory in upstate New York that made high-quality power tools, from industrial-grade sanders to wheel grinders. So, when Thomas woke up on a Monday morning early in May of 2005, his routine that day was pretty much the same as it had been for the more than 500 Mondays that had come before it. Hearing the alarm go off at around 5:30 a.m., Thomas automatically reached out an arm and shut it off before the sound could wake up Cindy, his wife of 16 years, who was sleeping in the bed next to him. Then Thomas got up, grabbed his work clothes, and headed for the bathroom. 15 minutes later, he was walking down the upstairs hallway of his family's modest two-story house, past the bedrooms of his two daughters, one 12 years old and the other 14. After getting downstairs, he walked into the kitchen, where he grabbed a cup of coffee and a quick bite to eat. As he sat at the kitchen table having his breakfast, he saw the family dog, Shadow, waiting at the back door, her tail slapping side to side. After he was done with his food and drink, Thomas pulled on a light jacket and a ball cap before opening the door and following Shadow outside into the chilly morning air. 15 minutes later, the dog was fed and back on her dog bed, the coffee cup and dirty breakfast plate were in the sink, and Thomas was climbing into his car and getting ready to back out of the driveway. But first, Thomas had to reach over his belly to pull on his seatbelt. And as he did this, he was reminded that he was a good 25 years and 50 pounds away from his physical prime, back when he was a U.S. Marine. Thomas had never seen combat while he was in the military, but his 6 years in the Marine Corps still gave Thomas a deep sense of pride, especially considering the fact that at the time, the United States Marine Corps was undertaking some of the most dangerous missions in the U.S. war against terror in Iraq. Pulling his mind back to the present, Thomas finally buckled his seatbelt, then started the car engine and backed out of the driveway onto the quiet residential street on the outskirts of Buffalo, the second largest city in New York State. After tuning the car radio to his favorite sports station, Thomas then headed north to pick up New York State Highway 5, which would take him to Clarence, New York, where Dynabrade was located. Settling back into the driver's seat, Thomas made the uneventful 12-mile drive from Cheektowaga, the town where he lived, to his company's factory and their surrounding sea of parking lots. Thomas found a parking spot shortly before 7 a.m., and then he hopped out of his car and walked inside the building to join the line of other Dynabrade machinists, all getting ready to clock in, put on their clear plastic safety glasses, and get to work. 8 long hours later, Thomas had clocked out and was back in his car headed home. In about half an hour, he'd be walking the dog again, and when that was done, he'd be taking his two daughters off to swim practice at the local swim club, where he spent so much time that the club had asked him to be its vice president. But as Thomas made the 20-minute drive back home, his thoughts had skipped ahead from swim practice and then dinner to how he planned to spend that evening. For years, Thomas had lived for his Friday nights. That was when he and some buddies from work got together to play poker. However, recently, Thomas had discovered a new hobby, one that was more exciting than poker, and one that he could enjoy every night of the week. Thomas had discovered an internet website called Pogo.com. Launched in 1998, Pogo was a platform that offered everything from Scrabble and Monopoly to card games like Blackjack. If you signed up for a membership, like Thomas had, you could skip most of the ads. Players used tokens rather than real money, but you could exchange those tokens for rewards and prizes of real monetary value. Players created usernames and online profiles, and not only could they play games against each other and with each other, but they could also use the chat room feature on Pogo that allowed them to message other players in their game, as well as other Pogo users that were outside of their particular game. While some of the chat rooms were technically listed as being just for kids, and there were other digital rooms that were just for adults, in reality, Pogo generally relied on its members and players to self-enforce the age restrictions. Thomas was aware that the site was used primarily by young people. He and his wife Cindy were both active in their local church, and as a Sunday school teacher himself, Thomas overheard his students talking about Pogo all the time. Thomas also knew that one of his younger co-workers at Dynabrade, a 22-year-old named Brian Barrett, was also a big Pogo user. In fact, it was Brian's offhanded mention of the site that had led Thomas to check it out in the first place. But after Thomas signed up for the site, and he saw how much fun it was to get to play cards every night, he quickly stopped caring about the fact that he was likely one of the oldest people on there. In fact, he didn't even think about it. He hopped into different games and chat rooms without so much as looking at the age restrictions on them. So, back on that Monday night in May of 2005, after Thomas had walked his dog and taken his kids to swim practice and had dinner, after all that, he shooed his 2 daughters off of the family computer in the living room, and with his wife Cindy sitting nearby in her usual spot on the sofa watching TV, Thomas made himself comfortable and logged into Pogo. Just typing in his screen name, which was Marine Sniper, gave him a sense of satisfaction. Thomas had never actually been a sniper in the Marine Corps, but the name reminded him of his glory days in the service. Usually, on Pogo, Thomas would just go straight to the Texas Hold'em poker rooms, but tonight he decided to play a little blackjack. But Thomas had hardly started looking at his first hand when he heard a ping and saw he'd gotten a direct message from another player with the screen name Tall Hot Blonde. Her private message just said to him, "You're in the wrong room. This room is for kids." Thomas had a moment of panic. He hadn't checked to see whether this chat room/game room was for kids or adults, and suddenly he wondered what would happen to him if it was revealed that he was a 40-something-year-old man playing with kids. Would he be kicked off of Pogo? Thomas did not want that to happen. Thomas loved Pogo. Playing these online card games and chatting with random strangers in the chat rooms had become an escape from the daily drudgery of his job and his routine. It also took his mind off the fact that in the last year or so, he'd had more and more problems with impotence, and that had put a strain on his marriage. His wife, Cindy, wanted to talk to him about it and spend more time together. Thomas, on the other hand, wanted to just ignore it and be left alone. So it didn't take Thomas long to decide how he was going to respond to Tall Hot Blonde's message. A second later, Thomas, aka Marine Sniper, wrote back, "Don't worry, I'm 18 years old. What about you? How old are you?" While Tall Hot Blonde didn't tell Marine Sniper her real name, she did tell him that she was a 17-year-old high school senior who lived in Western Virginia. She liked sports, and she played on her school's softball and basketball teams, and she wasn't sure yet what she was going to do after high school. "And what about him?" she typed. "Are you really a sniper?" Sitting there in front of the computer screen, Thomas felt a sudden, intense rush of excitement. The question had given him a very unexpected thrill. He would never meet this girl, and here he had an opportunity to play the part of his much more interesting and exciting and exaggerated younger self. So, Marine Sniper told Tall Hot Blonde that, yes, well, soon he would be a sniper. He was a Marine recruit for now who went by the nickname Tommy. He was about to start boot camp soon, then he would go to sniper school, and then after that he would deploy to combat in Iraq. By the time Thomas had shut down his computer 2 hours later, Tall Hot Blonde had sent him pictures of herself wearing a small yellow bikini that showed off both her curves and her flat belly. She'd eventually told him that her real name was Jessica, but she went by Jessie, spelled Jessi. She had one brother, and her family lived in a small house in the backwoods of West Virginia where nothing exciting happened, at least not since she had come in first place in a local beauty contest back in 2002. As Thomas turned out the downstairs lights and went upstairs to join Cindy in bed, he kept seeing those pictures of Jessie. With her wide smile, shoulder-length straight blonde hair, and long tanned legs, she more than lived up to the promise of her screen name. Thomas was already secretly hoping that the next time he logged on to Pogo, Tall Hot Blonde would be waiting for him. Thomas was still thinking about those pictures of Jessie when he woke up the next morning. And as soon as dinner that night was over, Thomas headed straight for the family computer. A minute later, he was on Pogo. Despite telling himself that this time he was just going to play a couple of hands of Texas Hold'em and then log off, Thomas kept clicking on his Pogo chat feature inbox, hoping he would see a private message come through from Tall Hot Blonde. And he didn't have to wait long. As soon as he saw the words, "Tommy, is that you?" pop up on his screen, Thomas felt that same thrill course through him that he'd felt the night before. And this time, there was no hesitation at all. Thomas began to add one lie after another to the fantastical story he told Tall Hot Blonde about Marine Sniper Tommy. After that, every night over the next few weeks, Marine Sniper and Tall Hot Blonde told each other intimate details about their lives. while the real Thomas Montgomery still got up early every morning to go to Dynabrade and spend 8 hours making components for power tools, in the evenings, he became the man he had dreamed of being. While Thomas was overweight and balding, Marine Sniper was 6 foot 2 inches tall and 190 pounds of pure muscle. While Thomas came home after work and walked the family dog and took his daughters to swim practice, Marine Sniper had the broad shoulders that Jessie had said she liked, along with a black belt in karate. While Thomas wore glasses and covered his bald spot with a ball cap, Marine Sniper looked a lot like a younger red-haired version of Hollywood heartthrob Harrison Ford. Soon, Jessie and Tommy had moved off of the Pogo chat feature and had started emailing each other and using Yahoo's instant messaging feature. Jessie's instant messenger name was Peaches0617, while Thomas went by Tommy Loves WV Fox. WV Fox stood for West Virginia Fox, clearly an allusion to Jessie. When Jessie finally asked Tommy to send her a picture, Thomas sent the headshot of himself that was taken almost 30 years earlier when he had graduated from boot camp. Even though it seemed fairly obvious that his picture was very out of date, Jessie didn't care. She was totally infatuated, and her fascination only grew as Thomas started concocting a tragic and hard-luck backstory for Tommy that would make Jessie feel protective and sympathetic. According to Thomas, Tommy's father had also been a Marine, Tommy's mother had died of cancer, and that had been such a terrible blow that Tommy's life had gone completely off the rails. In fact, his decision to join the Marines and become a sniper was so he could finally just make a fresh start with his life after a high school cheerleader had threatened to ruin his life by accusing him of rape. When Thomas told Jessie that before meeting her online, his plan had been to commit suicide in Iraq, Jessie had begged Tommy to stay alive for her sake. Jessie worried endlessly about Tommy's safety, and she told him again and again that despite whatever mistakes he had made in the past, she was proud of him and would always stand by him. After reading that, Tommy told Jessie that the Marine motto, Semper Fidelis, which means always faithful, should be their motto too. Over the next 6 months, both Thomas and Jessie would become completely obsessed with their relationship, to the point where it was the only thing either of them ever thought about. Unlike 46-year-old Thomas, who struggled with impotence, 18-year-old Marine Sniper told Jessie that he had 9 inches worth of endowment. Meanwhile, Jessie sent Tommy dozens of pictures of herself. However, none of them were her in the nude. She was always wearing clothes or a bathing suit. But to Thomas, the hours he spent wondering what was under those bathing suits made her photos even more enticing. There was one picture in particular, the camera peeking up under her miniskirt from behind, that really stirred Thomas's imagination. Within weeks of meeting each other, Thomas and Jessie were having virtual sex every night, and Jessie was telling Tommy that she loved him. Whenever Thomas's wife, Cindy, walked over to him and asked what he was doing on the computer, Thomas would immediately click out of the chat and insist that he was just playing online card games. And because Cindy was always asleep by the time Thomas eventually came to bed, she wasn't aware of the fact that Thomas was routinely staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning, telling Jessie all about what his, quote, snake would like to do to his, quote, foxy lady down there in West Virginia. And when Cindy did try to talk with Thomas about spending more time together, one of the remedies that their minister had suggested when they sought help for Thomas's impotence, Thomas told her that it was her nagging and her criticism of him that had led to his impotence problem in the first place, and so he didn't want to spend more time with her. He wanted to spend less time with her. Shortly after Marine Sniper and Tall Hot Blonde's online relationship had become very sexual, Thomas informed her that he had graduated from Marine boot camp and was now on active duty, and before long he would be shipping out to Iraq. This is when Thomas introduced to Jessie his totally made-up father and former Marine, Tom Sr. His role would be crucial to keeping the Marine Sniper fantasy alive. With the creation of Tom Sr., Thomas would be able to keep his daily connection to Jessie, who would be able to chat with Tom Sr. whenever Tommy was busy being an active duty Marine. And Tom Sr. would be able to pass her messages along to his son when Tommy eventually deployed to Iraq. In addition to speaking with Jesse every day online, either as Marine Sniper or through Marine Sniper's dad, Tom Sr., real-life Thomas also started calling 17-year-old Jesse every day of the week as he drove to and from his job at Dynabrade, claiming that those were the only times he was off duty from being a Marine. But even this added layer of connection to Jesse wasn't enough for Thomas, and in time, Thomas started to act very jealous. Whenever he noticed a new friend added to Jesse's MySpace page, MySpace was a very early social media platform, or saw that she was chatting with other people online in the public Pogo chat rooms, Thomas instantly suspected she had other boyfriends and therefore was cheating on him. And it was true that Tall Hot Blonde had become an accomplished cyber flirt and seemed to enjoy the power she had over Marine Sniper, who showed absolutely no interest in any other girls. Tall Hot Blonde and Marine Sniper had their first lover's quarrel when Thomas became convinced that Jesse was sending pictures of herself to other internet admirers. Jesse did not deny the accusation. However, she told Marine Sniper that she was devastated by what he was claiming. And so, to make Tommy feel better, she sent him a pair of her red G-string panties along with a silver Key to My Heart keychain. She sent the package to Thomas's real address. He had said that that was where his father lived and that he could forward any mail he got to Tommy wherever he was in the world. When Tommy received the panties, he forgave Jesse. However, his dad, Tom Sr., did not. Shortly after the panties arrived, Thomas, writing as Marine Sniper's father, Tom Sr., would send the 17-year-old girl a crude message calling her a bitch and accusing her of lying and trying to hurt his son. One evening, just before Christmas in December of 2005, so 7 months after first meeting Jesse on Pogo.com, Thomas once again chased his daughters off of the family computer and sat down to log into his Yahoo Instant Message account. For weeks leading up to that night, Thomas had begun talking incessantly to his coworkers at Dynabrade about how he was going to leave his wife, Cindy, and go to West Virginia to be with this new woman who had come into his life. 22-year-old Brian Barrett, who was the coworker who Thomas had overheard talking about having a Pogo account, wasn't really surprised to hear what Thomas was talking about. Brian had heard lots of the old-timers at Dynabrade going on and on about their big plans for escaping their lives. But Brian and the rest of Thomas's coworkers had no idea that Thomas's mystery woman was actually just a 17-year-old girl. As Thomas's instant messenger account loaded up on the computer, he glanced over at Cindy, who was in her usual place on the sofa watching TV. He barely noticed all of the Christmas decorations that his wife and his daughters had put up all over the living room that day. Because the only thing on Thomas's mind at that moment was what he was about to ask Jesse. He turned back to the family computer, and after exchanging a few casual messages with Jesse, Thomas got straight to the point. He told her that Tommy didn't know if he was going to make it out of Iraq alive. But before he shipped out, he wanted to marry Jesse. And would she have him? Jesse's answer came right away. Oh my God, yes, yes, she would marry her sweet, sexy Marine. The next night, when Thomas logged into his instant messenger account again, he saw excited messages from Jesse telling Marine Sniper that she was already planning their first night in bed together. It would be her first time, she told him, but she was more excited than nervous. She also told Thomas that from now on, even before they officially got married, she'd be referring to herself as Jessica Blair Montgomery. Days later, another package of Jesse's panties arrived at the Montgomery house, and along with them was a set of engraved dog tags that read Tom and Jesse, always and forever. Rationally speaking, Thomas knew that there was no way he could ever marry 17-year-old Jesse. But at the same time, he just could not accept that at some point he would have to give up not just Jesse, but Tommy, the Marine Sniper. And so, at some point, shortly after asking her to marry him, Thomas made up his mind. He decided he would find a way to marry Jesse and have a real life with her outside of the internet. And to do that, he needed to become 18-year-old Marine Sniper Tommy. And so, on January 2nd, 2006, while he was on a break at Dynabrade, he pulled out a piece of stationery with the company logo at the top and wrote a letter that was part New Year's resolution and part manifesto describing this vision he had for the future. It read, "On January 2, 2006, Tom Montgomery, 46 years old, ceases to exist and is replaced by an 18-year-old battle-scarred Marine. He is moving to West Virginia to be with the love of his life." Thomas also wrote in this strange letter that Marine Sniper had more than $2 million and would use that money to take care of Cindy and his 2 daughters, as well as help him build his new life with Jesse. At the end of this note, Thomas wrote, quote, "I wish I would know the exact time I would change to new Tom so I can prepare for it." After he signed his name to this letter, Thomas folded the piece of paper up and locked it in the toolbox he kept at work. In mid-March 2006, so 2 months after Thomas penned this New Year's resolution/manifesto, one of his daughters, who was home from school and waiting for her mom and her dad to get home, was researching an assignment on the family computer when she heard a ping. Thomas had accidentally forgot to log out of his instant message account before he left for work that morning. Okay, back to the story. And so the message that his daughter received came from Jesse, tall, hot blonde, and it was very sexually explicit and was clearly intended for Thomas. Thomas's daughter stared at the message, shocked. Could it really be for her father? Feeling sick, she pushed herself away from the computer and she called her mom, telling her there was something she needed to come home and look at. Hearing the strain in her daughter's voice, Cindy left work, and 15 minutes later, she was sitting at the family computer, scrolling through the hundreds of emails that her husband had written to a girl who went by the names Tall Hot Blonde and Peaches0617. Horrified, Cindy finally turned away from the computer and went upstairs and started searching through her husband's drawers and closet, where she would find a treasure trove of handwritten letters and pictures, lingerie, and a set of dog tags engraved with Tom and Jesse, always and forever. When Thomas finally pulled into the driveway that night, Cindy was waiting for him inside. As the mother of 2 teenage daughters, she could not believe that her husband had tricked and seduced a teenage girl who had never even been outside of the state of West Virginia into falling in love with an 18-year-old Marine who did not even exist. When Thomas stepped through the front door holding his car keys and lunchbox, he saw his wife standing in front of him. She looked sad and furious, and she was holding a handful of frilly girls' underwear, including a bright red G-string. Thomas knew, like a punch right to his stomach, that his wife knew his secret. And when he tried to act surprised, like he had no idea what Cindy was holding out to him, even trying to step around her into the hallway, Cindy was not convinced even for a second. Instead, she walked over to the family computer and began reciting out loud some of the lewd things Thomas had sent Jesse. Cindy told Thomas that what he was doing and what he had done was not only totally inappropriate and totally disgusting, but it was likely illegal. Jesse was a minor. And if that wasn't enough, Cindy told Thomas that his own teenage daughter had been the one to discover this raunchy affair. Cindy told her husband that he only had 2 options: give up this totally inappropriate, bizarre fantasy, or they could get divorced. As he stood there in stunned and guilty silence, Cindy told him that for now, he just needed to go away. Go walk the dog, go cut the grass, anything. But right now, she couldn't even stand to be near him. Thomas said nothing and turned around and walked back outside. As soon as Cindy was alone, she sat down at the kitchen table and composed a careful letter to Jesse. And as she slipped it inside of an envelope, she also enclosed a recent picture of the Montgomery family. "Let me introduce you to these people," Cindy had written. "The man in the center is Tom, my husband since 1989. He is 46 years old, and here are our 2 daughters, 12 and 14 years old." Cindy told Jesse that there is no Tommy, there is no Marine Sniper. Cindy closed the note with a piece of advice for Jesse: do not trust the words you read on a computer. When Jesse got Cindy's letter, she was completely crushed. Before breaking off all contact with the 46-year-old man she now knew had been posing as Marine Sniper, she sent Thomas a series of furious and hurt messages asking him how he could have done this to her and telling him he should have to go to jail for what he had done. For his part, Thomas, who still lived in the same house with his wife and daughters but slept in the basement, told Jesse he was sorry and that he never meant to hurt her. And Thomas told his wife Cindy that although he was totally ashamed of what he had done to her and to the family, he was relieved that she had found out, because the guilt and the stress of this double life had become an unbearable burden. And for the next 6 weeks, even though Thomas still occasionally logged onto Pogo.com to play cards, he did not hear another word from Tall Hot Blonde. But it would turn out, despite no longer communicating with Thomas, Jesse was nowhere near forgetting or forgiving what Thomas had done to her. She also began to wonder if maybe the letter she had received from Cindy was a trick. Maybe, thought Jesse, Cindy was really another girl who was also in love with Marine Sniper, and maybe Cindy had made up that whole story about Tommy being 46 years old and married with kids so that Cindy could have Tommy all to herself. Within 2 weeks of getting Cindy's letter and the picture of the Montgomery family, Jesse was back on Pogo, but this time she was looking for friends of Marine Sniper who could tell her the truth about him. On April 17th, Jesse got her answer. She had found another person online that Tommy had once mentioned to her. It was a user who went by the name Beefcake1572. He was a 22-year-old student at Buffalo State College who also worked part-time at a company called Dynabraid in upstate New York. This man's name was Brian Barrett. Again, the same Brian Barrett who Thomas had overheard talking about Pogo that had inspired Thomas to log into Pogo in the first place. And it didn't take much time in a private chat room for Tall Hot Blonde and Beefcake to put together all the pieces of the puzzle. It also didn't take long for Beefcake to fall completely in love with Tall Hot Blonde, who wasted no time sending him the same titillating pictures she had sent to Thomas. Jessie was Brian's ideal girl, blonde, beautiful, and athletic. When Beefcake confirmed that his coworker, Marine Sniper, really was 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery, and that he really did have 2 teenage daughters and a wife named Cindy, Jessie was crushed all over again. She was also very, very angry. As she and Beefcake got together in the Princess Priceless room on Pogo and played Lotso, which is a cross between bingo and the lottery, Jessie told her new admirer how hurt and heartbroken she was over Thomas's betrayal. It didn't take long for Beefcake to feel just as outraged as Jessie over the predatory and creepy behavior of this older man he once thought of as a good friend and coworker. So by the time Jessie got around to asking Beefcake if he would help her teach Thomas Montgomery a lesson, Brian, dazzled by Jessie's beauty and attention, was all in. He asked her, "What do you need me to do?" A couple weeks later, at the end of April, 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery logged onto Pogo. However, as soon as he was logged in, he got a message saying that his account had been suspended due to complaints of inappropriate activity. Stunned, Thomas logged off and started going on some of the other gaming sites he often visited outside of Pogo, and what he saw on them horrified him. On each of these other sites were forums where members of the site could post questions or offer insights or whatever they wanted to talk about, and then other people on the site could click on those individual posts and they could comment and interact with them. And when Thomas logged into each of these other gaming sites, the forum page where all these different topics are listed was the first thing he saw. And immediately, he saw his real name in several of these posts. And when he clicked on them, he saw the posts were all about how he was this 46-year-old predator and pedophile who posed as this Marine Sniper. When Thomas checked to see who had written these posts, his heart sunk. They were all from either Tall Hot Blonde or Beefcake1572, who he instantly recognized as his coworker, Brian. Meanwhile, Jessie and Brian became closer and closer. When Jessie suggested to Brian that he tell his coworkers at Dynabraid what Thomas had done, Brian didn't waste any time. He asked Thomas's coworkers if they remembered all that talk from Thomas about him leaving his wife Cindy and moving to West Virginia to be with this new mystery woman he had met. Then Brian put out the word that the mystery woman was really a 17-year-old girl that Thomas had met online by posing as an 18-year-old Marine sniper. It didn't take long for Thomas to start seeing the dirty looks and hearing the nasty comments all around work. He was now sure that half the people at his office thought he was a loser and a predator, and parents no longer wanted him to be around their kids. Also, Brian outright told Thomas that he and Jesse were now an item, and that every time they interacted, things got hot and heavy. At home, banished to the basement and now using his own computer, Thomas sent Jesse an instant message that hinted at suicide. It said, "You can say goodbye forever to me and Tommy." At first, Jesse was glad to see the damage her revenge campaign was doing to Thomas, and it was clear that Brian was also getting a thrill out of it as well. But eventually, Jesse started to feel bad about what was happening, and in a series of text messages that started a few weeks after she and Brian had begun publicly shaming Thomas, Jesse was back in touch with Thomas, telling him how much she missed her Tommy, and that Thomas was all she had left of her, quote, sweet, sexy Marine. Maybe, she told Thomas, they could just be friends, and together they could keep the memory of Marine sniper Tommy and the passion they had shared alive. But despite Thomas agreeing to this just be friends arrangement, his relationship with Jesse pretty much immediately became very sexual and intimate again, except now it was not just Thomas and Jesse, it was Thomas, Jesse, and Brian. Despite Jesse's promise to Thomas that she would end her relationship with Brian, she didn't, and instead she began going back and forth between the two men. And so in time, the hours that she and Thomas would spend messaging each other late into the night and early morning veered crazily between declarations of love and jealous outbursts from Thomas, who kept seeing Brian's username pop up alongside Tall Hot Blonde on Pogo, other gaming sites, and on Jesse's MySpace page. Meanwhile, the tension between Thomas and Brian when they were at Dynabraid together was palpable. Thomas was furious with Brian, not only for interfering with his relationship with Jesse, but for also very publicly humiliating him. And Brian, who had developed real feelings for Jesse, had become furious with Thomas and felt like he really was a predator and a pedophile and should just go away. Thomas and Brian would openly argue and fight with each other at work, and then when they went home, they would get online and spend hours accusing each other of telling lies about their relationship with Jesse. But by mid-May, Brian was just tired of the drama. And so he told Thomas that he was just going to go to West Virginia and he was going to see Jesse in person and likely become intimate with her in person, and then she would be all his. Even though Jesse told Brian, no, do not make a trip to West Virginia, the damage to Thomas was done. From that moment forward, Thomas became obsessed with the idea that Jesse and Brian were going to take their relationship out of the cyber world, where Thomas felt like he had a chance with Jesse, into the real world, where 46-year-old Thomas stood no chance. By early September 2006, this obsession had made it impossible for Thomas to be even remotely civil with Jesse. His messages to her had become so crude and so violent that Jesse had just begun to ignore them. And when she did this, it only made Thomas more angry and more obsessed. At 10:16 p.m. on the night of September 15th, 2006, Brian clocked out of his shift at Dynabraid. It was 63 degrees Fahrenheit and cloudy outside. The quiet and the light northeast breeze were a welcome relief after the noise and bright lights inside the machine shop. As Brian walked across the nearly vacant parking lot, he kept his head down and fished his car keys out of his pocket. When he got to his white pickup truck, he polished a small smudge off the driver's side door before opening it up and hopping inside. Before Brian put his keys into the ignition, he paused and noticed that the back left side of his truck seemed to be sagging slightly. But before he could figure out why it was doing that, he noticed off to his left in his peripheral vision, a shadowy figure was moving across the lot toward him. 2 days later, early on Monday morning, September 18th, Clarence, New York police got a 911 call from the security guard at the Dynabraid equipment factory. He just found the body of a young man who'd been shot dead at close range inside of his white truck that was parked in the Dynabrade parking lot. By the time the police arrived, so too had the first shift of Dynabrade workers. As the police set up a perimeter around the crime scene, co-workers stood by in total disbelief. Based on interviews with Brian's family, who had not seen him all weekend, and with his co-workers who identified his truck and his body, along with records that showed when Brian had last left the Dynabrade factory, it only took police a few hours to come up with a preliminary theory about what had happened. Whoever killed Brian must have taken the young man by surprise. Brian sat slumped in the driver's seat of the truck, leaning slightly towards his right, away from the closed window with the 3 bullet holes punched through it. There were bullet wounds in his upper left arm and jaw, and a gaping hole in the left side of his neck. Police noticed that Brian's back left tire on his truck was flat, and when they checked, they saw someone had punctured it with a knife. Also, a .30 caliber carbine rifle shell casing, as well as a peach pit, were discovered at the scene of the crime. Brian's family was devastated. They had absolutely no idea who might have wanted to harm their eldest child. When police interviewed Brian's parents, neither of them were aware of any problems or arguments that Brian was having at home, at school, or at work. But once police began interviewing Brian's co-workers at Dynabrade that Monday morning, they heard a very different story. It seemed to be common knowledge that Brian had had a serious falling out with a co-worker who had been acting more and more erratically in recent weeks. That co-worker's name was Thomas Montgomery, and it seemed like the two men had both been involved in an online relationship with the same woman, except she wasn't really a woman, she was actually a 17-year-old girl. Unable to locate Thomas, police were concerned, if he really was the killer, that Jessie, the 17-year-old girl, could be in danger. So police in New York went through Brian's cell phone and found contact information for Jessie, and then contacted authorities in Oak Hill, West Virginia, and asked them to do a welfare check on the girl. But before the West Virginia police could conduct that check, detectives in New York got in touch with Thomas and pulled him in for questioning. Thomas denied that he had anything to do with Brian's murder, saying that he had been at a local restaurant the night before and had arrived home sometime between maybe 10 or 10:10 p.m., which meant he would have been home when Brian was still alive and inside the Dynabrade factory. Thomas would admit to police that yes, he and Brian both did meet the same girl online, Jessie, and they had been squabbling over her. But Thomas said he would never hurt Brian. But it wasn't until investigators in New York heard back from police in West Virginia and tracked down additional cell phone data and spoke with Cindy Montgomery that they were able to piece together who had really killed Brian and why. At 1:33 a.m. on September 13th, 2006, so 2 days before Brian was killed, Jessie heard the ping of an incoming instant message. When she looked at her computer screen, she saw that it was from Thomas. It said, "You're a whore, and that's all you ever will be." For weeks, ever since Brian had told Thomas that he planned to drive to West Virginia to see Jessie in person, Thomas's messages to Jessie had become extremely abusive. Jessie had tried to calm him down, to get him to become, once again, her sweet, sexy Marine sniper named Tommy, but it just wasn't working. And so now, seeing this new message come across, Jessie took up a new strategy. She began ignoring him. And this drove Thomas mad. A day later, on September 14th, Jessie heard the ping of yet another incoming message, asking her if she planned to have sex with one of her boyfriends that day. Again, Jessie just ignored him. A day after that, early on the morning of Friday, September 15th, the day Brian was killed, Thomas woke Jessie up with a phone call, screaming at her in an uncontrollable rage. She hung up on him. Thomas Montgomery had reached a mental tipping point. On one hand, he knew that he could never really have a real life with Jessie. He also knew that his jealousy and rage were getting out of control. But the same part of him that had written out that New Year's resolution/manifesto back on January 2nd, 2006, felt that he still possessed somewhere inside the young Marine sniper whom Jessie had loved and who represented to Thomas the best version of himself. And so on September 15th, after screaming at Jesse on the phone and hearing the click as she hung up on him, Thomas made up his mind. He had waited long enough for his transformation from middle-aged machinist with a wife and 2 daughters into that battle-hardened Marine sniper who could and would defend what was his. That evening, Thomas told his wife, Cindy, that he was going to go out to dinner by himself. Once outside in his car, he looked in the back seat to make sure his supplies were all there. Then he turned on his car and drove to a fast food place near Dynabrade. After eating, Thomas left the restaurant and drove the short distance to Dynabrade. Entering the parking lot behind the factory, Thomas chose a parking space that was far away from the door where he knew Brian would exit. After his car was parked, Thomas climbed out of his vehicle. He was glad it was cloudy, and he was glad that the parking lot where he now stood was almost empty except for Brian's white pickup truck. Thomas finally finished eating his peach and dropped the pit onto the parking lot pavement. Now, as a Marine sniper, Thomas had to get the timing of this mission exactly right. He needed to get close enough to the truck to take his kill shots before Brian had a chance to drive away, but he also had to let Brian get into the truck without giving away his own position. And on his way in for the kill, he needed to make a silent puncture with his knife in the back left tire. This was his insurance policy. In case Brian did see him, it would make it very difficult for him to escape. Just after 10:16 p.m., the factory door opened and Brian walked outside into the parking lot. Brian didn't even look up as he walked towards his truck. To Thomas, what he was about to do almost seemed too easy. As soon as Brian had climbed into the truck and closed the driver's side door, Thomas was there like a shadow. And a second later, he had fired 3 shots through the closed window. Even through the blood spatter on the inside of the car window, he saw the massive hole in Brian's neck and knew that he was dead or was definitely going to die. Backing away from the truck, Thomas quickly returned to his own car, not realizing that he had dropped one of his shell casings. On his drive back to his house, Brian hoped his wife and daughters would be asleep. That way no one could contradict him when he said he'd gotten home that night before Brian had actually left the factory. But when police did interview Cindy a few days later, she would tell them that it was her recollection that her husband had not arrived home on the night of Brian's murder before 10:16 p.m. Cindy estimated that it was closer to 10:45 p.m. or later. And when police arrived at Dynabrade to question Thomas, he made a remark that instantly connected him in the minds of investigators to the peach pit they had found at the scene of Brian's murder. Thomas asked police if they could wait just a minute before questioning him so he could get the peaches he'd brought in for lunch out of his car so they wouldn't spoil in the sun. Although Thomas refused to give police a DNA sample, the police were able to pick up his DNA from a can of soda, and they found that it matched the DNA on the peach pit they'd found at the murder scene. A search of Thomas's house did not turn up a .30 caliber carbine rifle, but it did turn up an old photo of Thomas's gun cabinet that contained the exact same gun. Thomas's computer told investigators the rest of the story. In thousands of messages and emails to Jesse and Brian, coupled with his collection of Jesse's lingerie and other gifts, Thomas detailed his obsession with Jesse and his jealousy and growing hatred for Brian. Later, police would also discover the letter that Thomas had written that he kept locked in his toolkit at work. It was his New Year's resolution/manifesto that described wanting to leave 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery behind and become instead his 18-year-old alter ego, Marine sniper Tommy. On November 27, 2006, 2 months after Brian's death, police arrested Thomas and charged him with murder. And it was at this time that Thomas learned he was not the only person pretending to be someone else online. When West Virginia law enforcement arrived at Jessie's house to do that welfare check on her, her mother arrived at the door. When police told her that her daughter, Jessie, was in danger following the murder of a man she had likely been involved with online, the woman was shocked and told them that Jessie was not home. When police told her that they really needed to get in touch with her immediately and go get her in their own vehicles if necessary, the mother suddenly broke down and started crying, and then told police that she really did have a daughter named Jessie. But that was not the Jessie they were looking for. She, the mother, a slightly overweight 46-year-old housewife with short brown hair, whose real name was Mary Sheeler, was the 17-year-old girl, tall, hot blonde. It would turn out, for more than 16 months, Mary Sheeler had used her daughter's real identity to enter into multiple online relationships with men, sending them, just as she had sent Thomas and Brian, hundreds of pictures of the real Jessie, her daughter. When investigators asked her why she did this, Mary said she had joined Pogo to relax and kill time. After that, she enjoyed the drama and power and attention she got from manipulating the emotions of her many online admirers, none of whom she loved. In fact, she told investigators she was happily married to her husband of 23 years and was very devoted to her daughter, who had no idea any of this was happening and was off at college. But all that would change when the real 18-year-old Jessie discovered her own pictures and name all over the internet, along with details of how her own mother used her identity as bait for a catfishing scheme that left one man dead, one in prison, and 2 families in ruins. When police arrived at the jail and showed Thomas Montgomery a picture of the real tall, hot blonde, 46-year-old Mary Sheeler, the color from his face drained. Then, without saying a word, he turned around and faced the wall. He would eventually plead guilty and would be sentenced to 20 years in prison. There were no charges that could be brought against Mary Sheeler for catfishing, but her husband would divorce her, and her daughter, Jessie, would sever all ties with her.
Monday morning in March of 2005, a 67-year-old retired teacher named Jane Miller woke up at her home in Ohio. She yawned and stretched, feeling well rested after a relaxing weekend. The previous day, she'd gone to church with her family, then out to breakfast at their favorite diner, and she'd spent the rest of the day picking up around her house at a very leisurely pace. But after Jane sat up in her bed and rubbed her eyes and then opened them again, she yelped in shock. There, floating directly over her, was a disembodied head. Jane frantically reached over to her nightstand and grabbed her glasses. She slid them up her nose and looked again, hoping to see something different, i.e. not a floating face. But nope, it was definitely a floating face hovering right near the ceiling. And this face, in addition to being very odd because it's floating around in a room, also just looked totally bizarre. The head was shaped almost like a football, and it had piercing eyes and these yellowed buck teeth. And the face stared down at Jane with a hint of malice in its expression. Jane was obviously terrified. She leapt out of bed and raced downstairs to get away from this ghost in her room. Adrenaline was coursing through Jane's body as she fought to catch her breath, and when she reached the kitchen, she whipped around, and luckily, the ghost face was now gone. It had not followed her. With shaking hands, she grabbed the phone and called her older sister, Melissa. She knew that if anybody would believe this story, it would be her big sister. 10 minutes later, Melissa flew down the street towards her sister's house, risking a speeding ticket in this residential neighborhood to get to Jane's house faster. She pulled into Jane's driveway and threw the car into park, and then ran up the walkway to Jane's house. The moment Melissa stepped inside of Jane's house, immediately something felt off. She couldn't explain it. There was just a coldness in the air. She called out for Jane and found her sister in the kitchen, still in her PJs, sitting in front of an uneaten bowl of cereal. It had been sitting there so long that the Cheerios were bloated and soggy. Jane looked up at Melissa, but her eyes were distant and her face was pale and scared as she whispered that the faces were now above her and beside her and everywhere else she looked. Melissa glanced around, but all she saw was the empty kitchen and her sister sitting there with her soggy bowl of cereal. And so Melissa just asked Jane, like, "Hey, are you feeling okay?" And Jane nodded and said, "I'm not crazy, I'm telling you the truth." And suddenly, Melissa just felt so bad for Jane, and she assured her that, you know what, everything's going to be fine. She told Jane, "I don't think you're crazy," but inside, Melissa thought, oh my goodness, something mentally could be wrong with her. And that's when a realization dawned on Melissa, and she felt a chill run up her spine. Melissa had read about this kind of thing on Facebook, and she knew exactly who she needed to call. The next day, Melissa was back at Jane's house, anxiously anticipating the arrival of her guest. Just then, she heard a knock at the door, and Melissa raced over to greet Father Raymond Smith. He'd been the pastor at Melissa's church for almost 15 years, and Melissa hoped he'd be able to help Jane. Melissa thanked Father Smith for coming over on such short notice, and she explained how worried she was for Jane, and invited him to follow her upstairs to Jane's bedroom. Father Smith smiled and told Melissa that whatever was going on with her sister, they would get to the bottom of it. Melissa crept up the stairs to Jane's bedroom with the sound of Father Smith's footsteps right behind her. And right as Melissa reached the top of the stairs and turned the corner into Jane's bedroom, a wave of icy cold seemed to hit her. To Melissa, it immediately seemed like malicious presences were hovering all around her sister, and they didn't like it when Melissa was in the room. Jane was lying in her bed, the covers pulled up to her face. Melissa knew her sister had her eyes closed under there because pitch darkness made it harder to see all the menacing faces all around her. Melissa quietly told Jane that help had finally arrived, and Jane, when she heard this, threw back the covers to see who was there. She blinked and said hello to Father Smith, though she was clearly surprised to see him there. Melissa smiled to herself because this had been her intention, to make sure the creatures that were menacing Jane had no idea who was coming over here. Melissa turned to Father Smith and invited him to begin. Then Melissa stood to the side while Father Smith shook Jane's hand and asked her to explain to him what had been going on over the past couple of days. Jane was a little embarrassed as she began to describe what she was seeing and what she was feeling, but Father Smith didn't actually seem to be listening. Instead, he was studying Jane's hands very carefully, and he was watching her expression and all of her bodily movements, and Melissa even wondered, what was he doing? Finally, after Jane stopped explaining what was going on with her, Father Smith told Jane why he was there. He said her sister, Melissa, had called him yesterday, worried that Jane was suffering from demonic possession. Melissa nodded in the corner. From the moment Jane had described the hallucinations to her, Melissa suspected that a dark entity was possessing her sister, and so she'd called Father Smith in the hopes that he could identify the demons and maybe perform an exorcism to get rid of them. Father Smith was the most devout priest Melissa had ever met. If he couldn't banish the demons back to hell, it was doubtful anybody else could. Except when Father Smith spoke again, he looked at Melissa and told her that he actually wasn't sure there were any demons to banish here. He explained that as Jane was speaking, he'd been trying to see if she had full control of her body, and from what he could tell, Jane was fully in charge of her movements. He hadn't seen any of the involuntary twitches or tics that typically accompany demonic possession. Then the father looked back at Jane and asked her to follow the movement of his finger as he whirled it all around in front of her. Father Smith just shook his head as he watched Jane follow his finger flawlessly, and then Father Smith said that, in his opinion, Jane needed to see a doctor, not an exorcist. Melissa was sort of dumbfounded and asked Father Smith if he was absolutely sure, and Father Smith said that, yeah, the dead giveaway to him at least was that Jane knew her hallucinations were not real. But Father Smith promised that if doctors could not figure out what was wrong with Jane, well, the church would call a certified exorcist who was properly trained within the Catholic Church, and that exorcist could examine Jane's psychological state and determine whether she was genuinely possessed or not. Melissa decided this was a good compromise and agreed to take Jane to a hospital right away. Father Smith thanked her and then offered to pray over Jane before he left. Melissa said that would be nice and prayed silently as Father Smith recited a blessing with his hands outstretched. Three days later, Dr. Randall Crane stood in a hospital room with Jane, watching her sketch a little doodle on his notepad. Dr. Crane was an internal medicine resident at the hospital, and Jane was the most fascinating patient he'd had in a long time. She'd been suffering from these crazy hallucinations for the past few days and was scared that she was losing her mind. Now, Crane didn't know if that was actually true, that she was losing her mind, but he could not explain why she was hallucinating faces all the time, and so he couldn't rule out some form of dementia. And so Dr. Crane, kind of on a whim, had asked Jane to go ahead and sketch on his notepad what she was actually seeing, like draw the face. And so Jane finished sketching and handed the notebook back to Dr. Crane, and she warned him that she was no artist, but this is really what she was seeing floating over her head right now and all the time. Dr. Crane looked down at the doodle that Jane had drawn. The so-called demon face had an oblong, football-shaped head with big buck teeth and round, bulging eyes. It looked more like a Muppet than a monster. In all honesty, it actually reminded him of the main character in an old children's cartoon called Hey Arnold that the doctor had watched all the time when he was a kid. But even if the sketch was sort of funny, he took Jane's condition very seriously. He clearly understood why she'd be terrified to see something like this following her around all the time. And so Dr. Crane asked Jane a few questions, like whether these hallucinations had spoken to her, or if she was experiencing headaches, fever, or seizures around the time these hallucinations appeared, and she said no to all of them. And so Dr. Crane told Jane not to worry. He was going to order some routine blood work to see if maybe she had an infection, and he also ordered a toxicology screening just to rule out any bad drug interactions. An hour later, Jane sat on the examination table feeling very anxious. Dr. Crane told her that all her tests had come back normal, which actually initially made Jane more nervous. She wondered if now she and Melissa would have to call that certified exorcist after all. But Dr. Crane did not seem like he was totally confused. He actually said, "Jane, I want to look at your eyes more closely." And so Jane leaned forward and then followed Dr. Crane's instructions as he first tested her peripheral vision and then also her forward eyesight. And then afterwards, Dr. Crane informed Jane that she had a couple of small blind spots in her vision that he had just discovered that made him want to examine her retinas a bit more closely. Dr. Crane took a little vial of liquid out of his white coat pocket and then told Jane to look straight up. He was going to dilate her retinas, the light-sensitive tissue at the back of the eye that transmits what we see to the brain. The doctor would first pour a little of that liquid into her eyes, and then he would use a device called an ophthalmoscope to shine some light on her retinas and get a better look at what was going on. And so as the liquid made her eyes become more sensitive, the light from the ophthalmoscope stung a bit, but Jane did her best to stay still as Dr. Crane looked at her retinas. And then finally, Dr. Crane switched off the ophthalmoscope and he smiled. He would order a CT scan to confirm his theory, but he was pretty sure he knew exactly what was going on. And 2 hours later, the CT scan confirmed Dr. Crane's suspicion. He told Jane that he'd seen some tiny yellow tissue deposits behind her retinas. These are a sign that her retinas are deteriorating, a condition called macular degeneration. It happens to lots of people as they age. Their eyesight gets worse, and because of that, the brain gets less visual information from their eyes. Now, most people with macular degeneration end up with nothing more serious than slightly blurrier eyesight. But in about 10% of cases, the brain tries to compensate for the lack of information by making up new visuals. For reasons that are still not clear, many of these people who are in this 10% see floating faces. It's very rare, but the symptoms are so consistent amongst patients who suffer from it that Dr. Crane immediately understood what Jane's problem was the moment he saw her drawing that football-shaped head doodle. 3 months after her diagnosis, Jane was unfortunately still having hallucinations, but they were growing more infrequent. Dr. Crane told Jane that while there was no treatment, the hallucinations can stop over time as the brain becomes more accustomed to vision loss. And at the very least, Jane could rest assured knowing that she was not possessed by a demonic entity, and she wasn't losing her mind either. She just had a very creative brain. Here is our second story called The Perfect Condition. On May 19, 2010, 75-year-old Ron Sveden was at home in Brewster, Massachusetts, relaxing in his favorite armchair and flipping through TV channels in search of something good to watch. He'd finally settled on a game show when his wife Nancy called him for dinner. He sighed and turned off the TV, muttering about how he'd just gotten comfortable. He hobbled out of his chair and adjusted the plastic tube that he wore under his nose to help him breathe. The year before, Ron had been diagnosed with emphysema, a lung disease that causes shortness of breath. Emphysema is common in smokers, and Ron had been a smoker his whole life. Now, as a result, he needed an oxygen tank just to breathe properly. Ron sat down at the dining room table just as Nancy set a plate of scallops in front of him. Ron caught a whiff of melted butter, but his stomach didn't rumble with hunger the way it usually did when he smelled Nancy's amazing cooking. In fact, he didn't have an appetite at all, which was a shame because Nancy's scallops were his favorite meal. But Ron didn't want to be rude, so he thanked Nancy for dinner and tried to eat as best as he could, but he really just couldn't and just kind of pushed the food around his plate. And then when Nancy was done eating, Ron quickly got up and helped her clear the table and clean up before Ron settled back down to watch more TV. 2 weeks later, in early June, Ron was back in his favorite armchair in the living room, working on the daily crossword puzzle. He wasn't feeling his best, because he really had not eaten much since that scallop dinner a couple weeks ago. Now, Ron didn't think too much of it. He was getting older, and so he thought maybe he just didn't need as much food. Ron reread a clue on his crossword puzzle that had been stumping him all morning. He started to call out for Nancy, hoping she could help him, when a small tickle rose in his chest. He cleared his throat, and then all of a sudden he began coughing and hacking, and he couldn't stop. His chest felt stiff, like there was a wall of mucus that just was not breaking up. And so he leaned back in his armchair, coughing so hard it was getting hard to even breathe. He heard footsteps behind him, and a minute later, Nancy was by his side with a glass of water. Ron tried to sip some down, but another cough hit him and he spit the water everywhere. By the time this coughing fit passed, Ron's throat was so sore. He'd never experienced a cough like that, and it really scared him. He worried his emphysema was getting worse. Later that night, Ron was in his bedroom putting on pajamas when his back suddenly went stiff, almost like a spasm. He straightened up and kind of yelped in pain, and then threw his head back as another coughing fit overtook him. He hacked and coughed until he was shaking, and then Nancy came into the bedroom and rubbed his back until finally Ron began to recover. Once he had, Nancy asked him if he wanted to call the doctor, but he told her no. Clearly, his emphysema was just getting worse and he would just have to deal with it. After decades and decades of smoking cigarettes, he knew his lungs just were not what they used to be. A few days later, Nancy was moving all through the house, vacuuming and cleaning up, trying to prep the house for Ron's sister and brother-in-law who were coming over to visit. The couple had just gotten back from Scotland on a vacation, and they were coming over to talk about the trip and catch up. Secretly, Nancy hoped they'd brought home some Scottish shortbread to share. Just before 5 p.m., the doorbell rang, and so Nancy called out to Ron, who was asleep in his armchair when she last saw him. Then Nancy threw open the front door and embraced her in-laws. She was always happy to see them, but especially right now. She wanted to be around family. Over the past few days, Ron's coughing fits had become so severe and so frequent, it was kind of scary. It was common for Ron to be doubled over and hacking up a lung 15 or 16 times a day. And so Nancy was genuinely worried about Ron's health, and so just liked the idea of having some family around, maybe take her mind off of that for a second. Nancy's brother-in-law handed her a brown bag that smelled like butter and seafood. Nancy opened it as she led the way inside, and the bag was full of her favorite lobster rolls. Not from Scotland, but just from down the street. However, still, it was a welcome treat. Nancy led everyone into the living room, where Ron was still fast asleep. Nancy shook his leg and told him his sister was here, but Ron didn't move. Nancy frowned, but she could see Ron's chest was rising and falling, so he seemed okay. And so she told her in-laws it might be best not to wake him. His coughing fits had been really bad lately and clearly had been tiring him out. Nancy moved into the kitchen to grab plates for the lobster rolls. She could hear her in-laws taking seats in the dining room. And just then, Nancy heard a familiar, horrible cough erupt in the living room. Nancy felt terrible for Ron as she listened to him hacking. She knew it was also very painful for him. His throat had been raspy and hoarse for the last 2 weeks because of these coughing fits. Then, Ron started gasping between his horrible coughs, like he couldn't even breathe. And then Nancy heard him groaning a little as though he was calling out for help. And so Nancy rushed into the living room. Ron was rocking in his chair, fighting for air between these violent coughs. His entire body was shaking, and Nancy thought he might be having a seizure. Panicked, she dialed 911. For the next few minutes, Nancy and her in-laws tried to soothe Ron until the EMTs finally arrived. By the time they had Ron on a stretcher and were rolling him into the ambulance, one of the EMTs told Nancy that she'd been right to call. Ron's blood pressure and oxygen saturation levels were dangerously low. If she hadn't called, Ron would likely be facing organ failure. And so as the EMT helped Nancy up into the ambulance, she felt terrified. Now Nancy was the one who was shaking as the ambulance door closed and they whisked their way towards Cape Cod Hospital. The next morning, the pulmonary and critical care specialist at Cape Cod Hospital, Dr. Scott Slater, made his way to Ron's hospital room. When Ron was brought into the emergency room the previous night, he had been quickly diagnosed with pneumonia, a lung infection that creates a buildup of fluid in the air sacs. For someone of Ron's age, pneumonia can be a very dangerous and even deadly condition. Now, the ER doctor had immediately given Ron antibiotics to help him fight off the infection, but so far Ron was not getting better. So, just an hour ago, Dr. Slater had ordered a chest x-ray, and now, because of that x-ray, he had a better idea of what was going on inside of Ron's lungs. Dr. Slater knocked on the doorway and walked into Ron's room. Ron was lying in bed, hooked up to an IV and an oxygen tank. Ron looked pale and tired, and his breathing was labored. Nancy was sitting in a chair beside him, and she looked up from the newspaper she'd been reading and gave Dr. Slater a weak smile. Dr. Slater gave her a sad look and then delivered the bad news. Ron's x-ray had revealed that he had a collapsed lung, which was likely causing his pneumonia. Dr. Slater guessed that the lung had collapsed because something was blocking an airway. He needed to get a closer look by performing a bronchoscopy, which meant sliding a little camera down Ron's throat and into his lungs. After giving Ron an injection of local anesthesia, which would mean Ron was awake but unable to feel pain, Dr. Slater slid the camera down Ron's esophagus. And immediately, the problem became clear. There was an abnormal-looking mass at the top of Ron's left bronchial tube. Dr. Slater couldn't tell what this mass was, so he took a little tissue sample of this mass to send to the labs for analysis. After he'd pulled the camera out of Ron's throat, Dr. Slater explained to Ron and to Nancy that he had found this mass inside of Ron's lungs. Now, it would be a few days before they'd know for sure what it was, but the doctor felt they should know right now that that mass could be cancer. As Dr. Slater left the hospital room, Ron felt terrified. But Nancy, she shook her head and told Ron there was no point in panicking until they knew the biopsy results. And then she kissed Ron on the forehead and told him she was going to step into the hallway and call their kids and his sister and let them know what was going on. Ron watched his wife leave, feeling his chest tighten, but not because another coughing fit was coming on. He was thinking about how much time he'd have left if the biopsy came back positive for lung cancer. It could be a matter of months, or maybe even less. The thought of leaving his family now brought on this horrible wave of fear. He could feel tears welling up in his eyes as he looked out into the hallway and watched Nancy pace as she called their loved ones to break the terrible news. 4 days later, Ron was still in the hospital, sitting up in bed, tray of hospital food in front of him. He still wasn't hungry, so he just drank the juice out of the little plastic fruit cup they'd given him. Meanwhile, Nancy, who had barely left his bedside, was doing her best to try to coax her husband into taking a few bites. But just then, Ron heard a knock and looked up to see Dr. Slater standing in the doorway. Instinctively, Ron knew Dr. Slater had the biopsy results, and so Ron braced himself for the worst. But then, a smile crept across Dr. Slater's face. He told Ron and Nancy that there were absolutely signs of infection in the tissue, but no cancer cells. Ron was so relieved he almost started crying. He rubbed his eyes and felt Nancy's hand squeezing his shoulder. Ron breathed in as deeply as he could, trying to steady himself. He didn't have cancer, but there was still a mass in his lung, and Ron thought that couldn't be normal. And so he asked Dr. Slater, since this mass was not a cancerous tumor, well, what is it? Dr. Slater admitted to Ron that he didn't know, but he hoped that a second biopsy would help him find out. 10 days later, Dr. Slater sat in the office of a colleague, Dr. Jeff Spillane. Dr. Spillane was a thoracic surgeon who specialized in the organs and tissue inside the chest. Dr. Slater had always considered him a good friend, and now Dr. Slater hoped that Dr. Spillane could be a good consultant, too. Dr. Slater was feeling frustrated with Ron's case and really needed a second opinion. Dr. Slater explained to Dr. Spillane that Ron's pneumonia had persisted and his cough had gotten worse over the past week and a half. It was almost like Ron's body was trying to cough up the mass on its own. But after 2 biopsies, Dr. Slater still didn't have any idea what this mass was. It looked like a tumor, but it was not cancerous, so it wasn't clear why it was making Ron so sick. Dr. Slater bounced his knees impatiently as Dr. Spillane read through Ron's file. Finally, Dr. Spillane suggested that they do a third bronchoscopy, but this time they would put Ron under general anesthesia. If Ron was totally unconscious, they could do a more in-depth examination of Ron's chest. Dr. Slater was skeptical, but at this point, he was willing to try anything. So he agreed to let Dr. Spillane perform this procedure. Around 2 p.m. that afternoon, Dr. Slater was sitting in his office when he got a call from his friend Dr. Spillane. He'd just finished Ron's bronchoscopy, and now he said he had only one question for Dr. Slater. Did he have any dirt? For a moment, Dr. Slater was sure he'd misheard Dr. Spillane, until Dr. Spillane repeated himself and said that Dr. Slater was going to need some dirt for the thing he just found inside of Ron's lung. A sprouting pea plant, as in a living vegetable. Dr. Slater couldn't believe it. Ron must have eaten a raw pea that quite literally went down the wrong tube. Instead of landing in his stomach, it got into his lung. And there, the moist and warm conditions inside the lung were just right for the little pea to sprout. According to Dr. Spillane, the pea sprout was about half an inch long. It had clearly been in Ron's lung for a while because it was so coated in mucus that it looked like a little tumor. Dr. Spillane had easily removed the pea and surrounding mass, and Ron immediately began feeling better. Within a few days, he was coughing far less frequently, and his pneumonia disappeared. Ron still had emphysema, but it was far more manageable without the hacking cough. His appetite returned as well. In fact, his first meal when he left the hospital included a side of peas.
Before we get started, I want to give a special shout out to Billy Jensen, who is a fantastic true crime investigative journalist who wrote the article for the LA magazine called The Secret Life of Johnny Lewis. That article was used extensively in the making of today's video. So thank you, Billy. Johnny Lewis was only 7 years old when he landed his first acting role. Granted, it was only a bit part in an obscure escalator safety video, but it was a start. From there, Johnny appeared in dozens of commercials, including with Pizza Hut, before someone recognized this kid has real talent, and he earned appearances on the hit TV shows Seventh Heaven, Malcolm in the Middle, and Drake and Josh, which were really big in the late 90s and early 2000s. In 2001, when Johnny was 18 years old, he had made enough money from acting that he was able to leave his parents' home in North Los Angeles and move into a new home right in Hollywood with a bunch of other up-and-coming actors and actresses. By 2006, when Johnny was 23 years old, he was riding high. He had landed several more big TV roles, like a recurring role in the show The OC, which was very popular in the 2000s, and in 2006, he was dating the mega pop star Katy Perry. And although their romance was relatively short, apparently it was very intense because Katy would go on to write 2 songs that were apparently about Johnny. But Johnny's real rise to stardom occurred 2 years later in 2008 when he was cast as the character Half Sack on the critically acclaimed motorcycle drama Sons of Anarchy. While the show made him famous and fabulously wealthy, Johnny was growing concerned with the direction the show was taking. He felt like it was becoming too violent. Johnny liked reading poetry and studying philosophy and staying up late drinking tea and playing chess. He did not like acting out scenes of gratuitous violence. It just wasn't who he was. So after being on the show for 2 seasons very successfully, he was a very popular character. He went to the writers and said, "You gotta write me out of the script. I can't do this anymore." The writers were totally caught off guard and begged him to stay, but he had made up his mind, and so in 2009, his character was killed off. After leaving Sons of Anarchy, Johnny decided that he wasn't going to pursue any serious acting roles for the time being. Instead, he wanted to focus his time on writing his first novel, which was about this musical genius trying to make his way in the world. And so he started asking around to see if anybody he knew of a quiet place he could live and write out of. And his photographer said, "I think I know the place." It was called the Writer's Villa, and it was this beautiful house with 6 bedrooms for rent right outside of Hollywood. Over the years, it had become a sort of safe haven for up-and-coming actors and actresses still looking to land their big break. The reason it developed this reputation was because of the owner, Kathy Davis. She was this wonderful woman who really understood how difficult trying to break into Hollywood was for all these people that stayed at her house. And so she would look after them and make them food and offer them rides. And she would stay up late and listen to their frustrations and be a shoulder to cry on if they didn't get the part they wanted. Many of her tenants, who went on to be big Hollywood stars, would later attribute their success, at least in part, to the time they spent with Kathy at the villa, which they remembered as being therapeutic and soothing. Even though Johnny had already had his big break in the Sons of Anarchy, he loved the idea of living in such a peaceful place that seemed to cater to eccentric artists like himself. So in April of 2009, Johnny called Kathy and requested a room, and she said, "Absolutely, you can stay on the 2nd floor in the red suite." After moving in, Johnny would tell his friends that the writer's villa was just as amazing as he thought it was going to be. And Kathy specifically was just as wonderful as everyone said she was. He actually struck up a friendship with her almost immediately. Everything seemed to be going really well for Johnny in his life until a few months later, he found out his girlfriend, Diane, was pregnant. Although this totally screwed up his plans for his novel, Johnny was really excited about being a father, and so he decided to move out of the villa and in with Diane, who lived nearby, to help take care of their child. 9 months later, on April 6th, 2010, Diane gave birth to to a healthy little girl named Culla May, and Johnny and Diane fell madly in love with her. But unfortunately, Johnny and Diane's love for each other faded quickly after becoming parents, and before long, Johnny had moved out and back in with his parents. Not long after that, Johnny and Diane became embroiled in this really vicious, long custody battle over Culla May, which ultimately Johnny lost, which was devastating for him. A few months later, in October of 2011, when Johnny was still living with his parents, he decided to take his motorcycle out and just go ride around and clear his head. And so he drove for about 2 hours to the west of LA out into the desert, where he lost control of his bike and he crashed. After getting to the hospital, his injuries were determined to be relatively minor, except they were concerned he might have a head injury. However, after testing negative for a concussion, he was said to be okay by doctors and he was sent home. But when he got home from the hospital, he was not okay. He was a totally different person. Johnny's father, Michael, immediately noticed the change in his son's behavior. He just started acting really weird and erratic, and his thoughts weren't always coherent, and he was really agitated all the time. It was just very obvious that something was off. And it made Michael wonder, perhaps my son did get a head injury from that motorcycle accident, and the doctors just missed it. And so Michael scheduled 2 separate MRIs for Johnny to go to, but for whatever reason, Johnny refused to go. Around this time, Johnny's friends began to notice his strange behavior when in December of that year, he was at an acting class and he began speaking in a vaguely British accent. And everybody in the class noticed it, and eventually someone said, "Hey, why are you doing that?" And Johnny was like, "What?" and just kind of shrugged it off and acted like he wasn't doing that. A few weeks later, on the morning of January 3rd, 2012, Johnny was at his parents' house and he was sitting in the kitchen while his mom was making omelets, and Johnny just kind of abruptly says, "I'm gonna go out for a walk." So he gets up, he's only got his pajamas on, no shoes on, he walks out the door, and as he's walking down the road, he gets maybe 10 or 15 feet away from his parents' house when he hears someone screaming, like they're screaming in distress, and he thinks it's coming from the apartment that was right next to his parents' house. And so he breaks into the apartment, but there's no one in the apartment. It's totally vacant. And so as he's in this apartment, wondering what's going on, the 2 men that owned the apartment, they came home and they see Johnny standing there, and they told him he had to leave immediately. And instead of leaving immediately, Johnny grabbed a nearby glass bottle and he charged at them and hit them both over the head with the bottle before they managed to restrain him and hold him down until the police showed up. Johnny claimed he was acting in self-defense, but the police didn't believe him, and so they charged him with trespassing, burglary, and assault with a deadly weapon, and they sent him to jail. When Johnny's father was finally able to come to the jail and bail his son out, it had been 8 days, and in those 8 days, Johnny had been moved from general population to a psych ward because he was banging his head against the inside of his cell, and at one point he had tried to jump off of a balcony, and he was just generally acting unhinged. And so when he was discharged, on his paperwork, a doctor at the jail had commented that he thought Johnny at one point must have had some sort of head injury that had made him act this way, and he was definitely suicidal. When Johnny got back to his parents' house, he was an absolute wreck. Physically, he had 2 black eyes and his face was all puffed up from the confrontation he had with those 2 men in the apartment. And emotionally, he was so distraught that he wouldn't let anyone in his family come near him. He just holed up in his room and just told everyone to stay away. He also became extremely sensitive to light, to the point where he was turning off all the lights in his parents' home, and then when they would eventually just turn them back on again, he would get agitated and turn them all off, and then finally he just disabled his parents' fuse box. But despite Johnny's obvious issues after coming home from jail, over the next few weeks, he did actually seem to be improving, to the point where at the end of January, so about a month after he came home from jail, his parents allowed him to move out and go live on his own in Santa Monica, California, about 30 minutes away. But as soon as he was living on his own, his troubles started again. On February 10th, so about a week after moving into this place in Santa Monica, he was arrested for punching some random stranger in the head outside of a yogurt shop, but he was ultimately released on $20,000 bail. A couple of days later, Johnny, fully clothed, just walked into the ocean, and when he was pulled out, he had to be brought to the hospital to be treated for hypothermia. A couple of days after getting out of the hospital, he was arrested again, this time for trying to break into a woman's apartment in Santa Monica. He claimed he thought it was his friend's apartment, but nobody believed him, so he was brought to jail and then released on bail again. After this second arrest in Santa Monica, Johnny's parents finally convinced him to go see a doctor about this potential head injury they thought he got from that 2011 motorcycle crash. Even though that jailhouse doc had suggested Johnny had a head injury, he had not officially diagnosed him. So Johnny needed another doctor to officially diagnose his head injury so they could begin to treat it. But the doctor Johnny wound up seeing did not suspect a head injury. Instead, he suspected schizophrenia or bipolar, which are two very serious mental disorders. And so he prescribed some medication to Johnny that would treat both of those disorders, and Johnny was on his way. Johnny refused to take the medication and refused to go see another doctor, and so his condition just continued to get worse. Johnny was still facing serious jail time for the break-in and assault against those two men in the apartment next to his parents' home, and so Johnny's lawyer was trying to get a deal done where Johnny would go to a mental health treatment facility for a year instead of going to jail for a year. But Johnny was so confident these charges would just get dropped and he'd be allowed to go back to his life and live the way he wanted to, that he fired his lawyer and he represented himself in court. But the charges were not dropped and he was sentenced to 1 year in prison. However, the jail he was sent to was so overcrowded, they reduced his sentence all the way down to only 6 weeks. When Johnny's father finally came to pick him up from prison on Friday, September 21st, 2012, Johnny was at an all-time low. Even though he had only been in jail for 6 weeks instead of the year he was supposed to be there, it was clear that amount of time had done an enormous amount of damage to him. And so on the car ride home from prison, Johnny just kind of sheepishly asked his father, hey dad, would it be possible if you called Kathy Davis at the writer's villa and just see if there's any way I can move back in? And Michael's thinking to himself, I hadn't thought of that, but the writer's villa was the last place Johnny was when his life was still in order. It was probably the last place he was happy, and so he probably has attached a lot of fond memories to that place, and so that's a great place for him to go. And so as soon as they got home, Michael called Kathy Davis and explained the situation and said, is there any way he can stay there? And she said, absolutely, the red suite is still available. I'll go up and make the bed right now. I can't wait to see him. Johnny stayed with his parents that weekend, and then on Monday, September 24th, he packed up his stuff and he moved back into the villa. 2 days later, a 70-year-old man named Dan Blackburn, who was actually neighbors to the writer's villa property, he was looking out his front window at this man who was standing out in the road. He only had on jeans and red shoes. He had no shirt on and he was very sweaty, and he was just kind of frantically pacing around the road, and he had never seen this guy before, and so he's just kind of poking out behind his curtain watching him to see what he's going to do next. And after about 15 minutes of this kind of strange pacing in the road, this guy turns and walks directly towards Dan's property, goes right up to the front step and starts knocking on the door. Dan was definitely a little bit concerned, but he shut the curtain, he walked over to the door, and he looks out the peephole, and there's this guy standing there with bright blue eyes that are all wide, and he's looking at the peephole as if he can see through and see Dan, but he can't. And so Dan reaches down and he opens the door just a little bit and he looks out, and the guy outside looks at him and goes, "Hi, I'm John. I'm your new neighbor." It would turn out John was Johnny Lewis. And so Dan opened the door a little bit farther and he looks at him and he goes, "Hi, John, nice to meet you." And before the two men could have any sort of conversation, Johnny just abruptly turned around and walked away. And so Dan is totally puzzled by this strange interaction he's just had with Johnny Lewis. And he's watching him as he just walks back to the road, he walks back over and goes inside the villa and disappears. And so Dan kind of shrugs it off, he shuts his door, locks it, and goes back to his morning routine. About 30 minutes later, Dan is doing his own thing in his house when he hears his wife outside screaming for him to come outside. And so Dan runs out the front door, he goes into his driveway, which is between his property and the writer's villa, and he sees his wife is standing on the driveway, horrified, pointing up towards the back of their house. He looks down, and back near their back deck, Johnny Lewis, is standing on top of the guy that Dan and his wife had hired that day to paint their back deck. Johnny is just raining blows down on this guy. He's got a piece of wood too that he's hitting him with, and the worker is sitting there trying to shield himself. There's blood all over him, and Dan instinctively just runs over to Johnny. Johnny's not seen Dan at this point. Dan gets right up to him and he grabs him by the shoulder and he tries pulling Johnny off. He's screaming at Johnny to stop, but Johnny just seems totally unfazed. He's just destroying this worker. And so finally, after Dan yanks on Johnny hard enough, Johnny jumps up, turns around, and levels Dan square in the face. Dan falls to the ground, and when he looks up, Johnny is just standing over him, looking at him with no expression on his face. It's like he didn't know what he was going to do with Dan next, so he just stood there and stared at him. But Dan wasn't going to waste any time. He jumped up and he clocked Johnny square in the side of the head, but it had no effect on Johnny. He still just stared at Dan, completely expressionless. And so Dan grabbed a nearby lawn chair and practically broke it over the head of Johnny, but again, it had no effect on Johnny. He just stood there completely expressionless, staring at Dan. And so at this point, Dan just grabs the worker who can barely stand, and he runs back down the driveway. He grabs his wife, and they run towards the house to go inside. And the three of them manage to get inside the house, and as they're shutting the big, heavy door, Johnny comes bounding up and he gets right in front and he jams his arm in the space between the door and the wall. So they can't close the door because it's getting stuck on his arm. And so all three of the adults inside, Dan, his wife, and the painter, are putting all of their weight on this huge wooden door onto Johnny's arm. And Johnny is just trying to grab them the whole time. And so finally, the three of them start raising the door and slamming it as hard as they can on Johnny's arm. And finally, after several hard blows to his arm, Johnny retracted his arm and they were able to shut the door and lock it. And so at this point, Dan's wife and the painter ran around the house, closing every window, locking every door. Meanwhile, Dan went to the side window that looked out towards the Writers Villa property, and he got his phone out and he called 911 as he's looking out the door looking for Johnny. And so after he tells 911 what's going on and he hangs up, Johnny suddenly just appears running down his driveway as if he's running back towards the back deck. But he stops almost right in front of Dan's window. He turns and he starts running towards the villa property. He jumps over a fence that's at least waist height, just jumps clear over it. And then he gets to this huge wooden fence that surrounded the entire villa property that was at least, 8, 9, 10 feet. And he very easily just jumps, grabs the top, and catapults himself right over the top and then disappeared inside of the villa. Within minutes, the police showed up and they went inside the villa and they could not believe what they found. Based on the evidence, this is what investigators believe happened. After Johnny, for the first time, walked up to Dan's property and awkwardly knocked on the door and said, "Hi, I'm John, I'm your new neighbor." After that, he turned around and Dan watched him as he left his property and made his way back and went inside the villa. Once Johnny got inside the villa, he made his way up to the second floor and he went into Kathy Davis's room where she was sitting. Now, Kathy most likely turned and saw Johnny standing in the doorway. He's got no shirt on, he's sweating, he looks totally crazed. She probably was not scared. Instead, her motherly instincts kicked in and she probably said, "Hey, are you okay? Can I help you? What's going on?" And as she probably stood up and made her way over to make sure he was okay, Johnny, for reasons no one understands, proceeded to beat and kick and strangle her. And then when she fell to the ground and was totally helpless, Johnny proceeded to either stomp on her skull repeatedly or he hit her over the head repeatedly with a rusty hammer that was later found in his bedroom. But no matter how Johnny did it, he managed to severely fracture her skull, and that's what ultimately killed her. After killing Kathy, Johnny tracked down her beloved cat and killed the cat the same way. Afterwards, Johnny ran out of the villa, and that's when he spotted Dan's house painter just sitting outside, and he walked over to him and just began beating him. And just like the attack on Kathy and her cat, this attack on this house painter appeared to have no motive as well. After Dan came outside and managed to fight Johnny off, and then when Dan went back inside the house with his wife and with the painter, Johnny stood outside for a few minutes before running down Dan's driveway and then hopping over those two fences right in front of Dan, and then Johnny disappeared inside of the villa. Once Johnny was in the villa, it's believed he climbed up to the upper patio or onto the roof of the villa itself, and from there he either jumped or fell to his death on the driveway below. His death was officially ruled an accident, not a suicide. After the news broke about what had happened at the Writers Villa, everybody assumed Johnny must have been on some really hardcore drugs. That's the only explanation for why someone would act the way he acted. But when his toxicology report came back, it showed he had absolutely no drugs of any kind, legal or illegal, in his system. He was completely sober at the time he committed this horrible crime. Some believe Johnny really did have some undiagnosed head injury from that motorcycle accident, and this head injury is responsible for his violent outbursts. Others disagree and say the head injury had nothing to do with it. Johnny clearly had some undiagnosed mental disorder. Maybe it was schizophrenia, maybe he was bipolar, maybe it was something else, but it was this mental disorder that led to these violent outbursts. But to this day, no one knows for sure why Johnny did what he did. All we know is an innocent woman and her cat were needlessly killed. So that's going to do it. In the early 1960s, two high school classmates in South Carolina named Carol and Reggie fell in love with each other. Every day in the halls, they'd hold hands and they'd laugh with each other and whisper to each other, and then outside of school, they were inseparable. But despite their seemingly perfect relationship, it didn't last long. They both had different ideas about what the future should hold, and so after graduation, they broke up. Reggie went on to join the US Navy, where he served for a number of years all over the world. He would at one point get married, but that marriage would end quickly, and then after he got out of the military, he got a job at a railroad back at his hometown in South Carolina. As for Carol, after graduation, she got married and divorced too, twice actually, but it was her second failed marriage that nearly killed her. On February 18th, 1987, Carol was living with her 10-year-old daughter Rhonda in South Carolina when her estranged second husband came up to the door and knocked. Carol opened the door, and her ex-husband drew a gun and shot her 6 times in front of her daughter before turning around and fleeing. The police would later find his body inside of his car on the side of the road. He had shot himself. As for Carol, the doctors were able to save her life, but the injuries she sustained from the attack were crippling. She was blind in one eye and she had chronic pain, and so her young daughter had to start taking care of her full time. Over the next 8 years, Carol steadily improved and regained some of her independence, but in 1995, she had a huge setback. She started feeling ill, and so she went in to see a doctor, and the doctor did a blood test, and they discovered she had liver cancer. It would turn out the blood that was given to her after the attack, that had been transfused into her body to save her life, it had been tainted with hepatitis C. And so she got hepatitis C without realizing it, and because it had been untreated, it led to liver cancer. Rhonda remembers when her mother came home after being given this terrible news, she just sat down and was silent for a minute, and then she just kind of muttered to herself, I just can't get away from this man. He's killing me all over again. But despite being dealt such an unfair hand in life, Carol was determined to not let her injuries or her illness define her. And so she went out looking for a job that could accommodate her physical limitations, and she found it. She was hired as a part-time customer service rep for a television cable company. She was very happy about this job and very proud of it because it was the first time she was working after the attack, and so for once it felt like her life was going back to normal again. A few years later, in 2000, when Carol was working at the cable company, her phone rang and she answered it the way she answered every other call, but the voice she heard on the other end, she immediately recognized. He introduced himself as Reggie Sumner, and so Carol asked him, are you the Reggie Sumner from 1962 at Garrett High School in South Carolina? And he said, yeah, that's me. And Carol said, I'm your ex-girlfriend. We dated in high school. And so it was this incredible reunion, this totally chance phone call. And for the next hour or so, they just chatted on the phone about everything from their kids to their relationships they've been in to what they're up to now. I mean, they had a lot to catch up on since they hadn't seen or heard from each other in nearly 40 years. And so before they hung up, they realized they lived near each other, and so they made plans to get together in person. Rhonda would say her mother, when she came home that night, was like a 16-year-old girl all over again. She talked endlessly about how great Reggie was and how good-looking he was and how excited she was about their upcoming date. And so a couple of days later, Carol and Reggie have this date, and when Carol comes home, Rhonda would say it was obvious her mother had fallen head over heels in love with Reggie all over again. And luckily, Reggie had fallen in love with Carol too, because less than 6 months later, they got married and became Mr. and Mrs. Sumner. Within a year of their marriage, they decided to sell their home in South Carolina and move to Jacksonville, Florida to retire. Even though caring for her mother for all those years had been quite difficult for Rhonda, she said she was very sad to see her mother go, but at the same time, she was really happy for her because it seemed like she had found the one. Over the next couple of years, Rhonda stayed in touch with her mother, speaking to her almost every single day on the phone. But in July of 2005, Rhonda's mother stopped answering her phone. At first, Rhonda wasn't that concerned, but after 24 hours of not hearing from her mother or from Reggie, she did get concerned. Because even though Reggie was able to care for Carol, he wasn't in the best shape himself. He had debilitating diabetes, and he had recently broken his leg, and so was largely confined to a wheelchair. And so if they were to leave their house for an extended period of time, they wouldn't do it without asking for help from Rhonda. And so over the next couple of days, Rhonda incessantly called her mother and called Reggie, but she never got through to them. And so finally, after after almost 72 hours of not hearing from them, she decides to just hop in her car and drive the 4 hours to Jacksonville to check on them personally. When she got there, she saw her mother and Reggie's car was not in the driveway like it normally would be. And so Rhonda went up to the front door and she knocked and she's yelling for her mom, but nobody's coming to the door, even though lights are on inside the house. And so Rhonda eventually tries the handle of the door and it's open. And so she opens it up, she steps inside, she yells again for her mom and for Reggie, but no one yells back. And then she sees their beloved dog, Mikey, that they brought everywhere with them, was still in the house. And so she's thinking, where would they have gone without bringing Mikey? And so Rhonda continues to walk through the house into the kitchen. And when she gets there, she sees on the table are 2 plates of food where the food looks like it's a couple of days old and it's just sitting on the plate like they had been eating it and then just abandoned it there. And then in the sink are all these dirty dishes. And then on the stove are half-cooked pots of food. And Rhonda knows her mother is an extremely tidy person and she never would have left her house with dirty dishes and food out on the table. And so red flags are going up for Rhonda. But what ultimately sealed the deal for her was when she turned and looked on one of the counters, she saw the cell phone that Reggie and Carol shared was still sitting there along with Carol's purse. And then next to that was both of their medications, which was Reggie's insulin and Carol's liver cancer medication, both of which were life-saving and needed to be taken every single day. There's no way they would have left the house without those things. And so Rhonda immediately calls the Jacksonville Police Department and she files a missing person report. And before long, the missing couple's story is all over the news and all of the networks are asking people if they have information to come forward. But no one came forward. And so the only lead the police had was to track down the Sumners' car, which was missing from their driveway when Rhonda showed up at their house. So the police shared the description of their vehicle all across the state, and very quickly they got a hit. The car had been found abandoned in a Florida town about 1 hour west of Jacksonville. It had been parked in this semi-forested, very secluded area off of a dirt road, and there was nothing inside of it, but they saw the battery had been taken out, leading some of the officers to speculate that perhaps the Sumners really had just driven away from their home without telling anybody and then ran into car troubles. But that theory would quickly be thrown out the window when 5 hours later, the Jacksonville police received a very strange phone call. The man who called in said he was Reggie Sumner, and he said he had seen the news about him and his wife being missing and that was just totally not true, that in reality they had left, but they were just fine and they'd be back soon. The police are immediately suspicious of this person. They don't think it's Reggie Sumner because, for one, he sounds like a young man and Reggie is a 61-year-old. And so the voice didn't really line up. And just the way he was talking about this disappearance like it was no big deal, that also just didn't really make sense. And so one of the officers asked Reggie, "Are you with your wife, Carol?" And he said, "Yep, I'm with her. Here she is." And so a woman hops on the phone who says she's Carol Sumner, but she sounds far too young to be Carol Sumner, who's 61. This sounds like a 18, 19, 20-year-old girl. And she too just reiterates that everything's just fine and they've gone out for a couple of days. There's nothing to worry about. And, you police can stop looking for us. And so after this call ends, the police at this point are convinced that this simply cannot be Carol and Reggie. But to make sure, they call in Rhonda and they have her listen to the recording of this conversation with the so-called Reggie and Carol. And right away, Rhonda says, "That's not my mom and that's not Reggie." And so at this point, the police assumed that these two people who called in pretending to be the Sumners probably had something to do with the disappearance of the real Sumners. And so while they waited for the trace on this phone call to come back, which would give them information about who was calling and from where, the police decided to investigate another angle. The police looked at the Sumners' bank statements and they saw their bank card had been used at an ATM in South Carolina after the Sumners had been reported missing. And so they called that bank and they asked for the CCTV footage from that ATM. And when they watched it, they saw that it was not Carol or Reggie Sumner withdrawing funds. It was some unknown man in his early 20s. Right after this discovery of this unknown man, the trace from the phone conversation with the imposter Sumners came back, except it was tied to a fake name at a fake address. So that wasn't helpful to the police in their investigation. However, when they went through this cell phone's call logs, which they got with the phone trace, they saw whoever owned the cell phone had recently placed a call to a car rental company in South Carolina. And so the police call this car rental company and they speak to the manager and they're able to figure out that somebody using this cell phone number had indeed called and had rented a car, and the car they rented matched the description of the car the unknown man was driving in the ATM surveillance footage. But this car had been rented to a woman. Her name was Tiffany Cole. The rental company told police that all of their cars had satellite tracking information built into them. And so police were able to use that information to track Tiffany's rental car to a motel in South Carolina. The initial thought was that maybe the Sumners are being held against their will in this motel. And so very quickly, a police force was organized, and on the morning of July 14th, so 6 days after the Sumners were listed as missing, they arrive at this motel, they go to the front desk, they find out what room Tiffany is in, they get the key, and they go up and they open the door. The Sumners were not inside. Instead, there were 3 young adults sitting there. It was 24-year-old Tiffany Cole, her boyfriend, 23-year-old Michael James Jackson, and his friend, 19-year-old Alan Wade. Also in the room were dozens of bags of recently purchased merchandise, like computers and video games and clothes and perfume, and also they discovered the key to the Sumners' vehicle and Reggie Sumner's prized coin collection. The police brought all 3 back to the police station and put them in separate rooms to be interrogated. At this point, it was obvious to police that these 3 had something to do with the Sumners' disappearance. They had all these things in the room that tied them to the missing couple. And so now the police, as they interrogated them, it was not so much about connecting them to the Sumners as much as it was about helping them find the Sumners. At first, all 3 of them either didn't talk or were totally uncooperative. But under intense questioning, Tiffany cracked a little bit. She said that they had robbed the Sumners, but nothing more. They didn't do anything else besides rob them. And there had been a 4th person involved in the robbery, 19-year-old Bruce Nixon, who was friends with Alan Wade. Bruce lived nearby, so the police quickly rounded him up and brought him in for questioning, and unlike the other 3, Bruce immediately caved. And the story he told about what happened to the Sumners brought many of the police that were involved in this investigation to tears. He said it all started with Tiffany. Tiffany used to be neighbors with the Sumners back when they still lived in South Carolina. Tiffany had a pretty rough upbringing, and her father was permanently sick, and so the Sumners kind of took her under their wing and looked after her and built a very close relationship with her and kind of treated her like she was one of their daughters. Anything she needed, if she needed money, food, anything, they would give it to her. For example, in 2001, right before they left for Florida, they sold a car to Tiffany, but they sold it for basically nothing because they knew she didn't have any money and she really needed a car. 4 years later, in June of 2005, Tiffany was partying in Jacksonville, Florida with her new boyfriend, Michael James Jackson, when they got kicked out of the house they planned on staying in for the night. And so now they don't have a place to stay, they don't have any money, and that's when Tiffany remembers the Sumners had moved to Jacksonville and they would always help her out if she needed anything. And so the 2 of them drive to the Sumners' house in the middle of the night, they haven't called them, and they just knock on the door, totally uninvited, and Carol comes to the door, and when she opens it, she sees Tiffany, and immediately she's like, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in so long. Come in, come in. Who are you? Oh, Michael, great to meet you. Come on inside. I'll get you food. We'll get you fed. What do you need? What can we do for you?" And so that's when Tiffany explains to them that their plans had kind of fallen through and they didn't have a place to stay that night, and would it be possible to stay with them? And so Carol and Reggie right away say, "Absolutely no problem. Tiffany, Michael, you guys are guests here. You're welcome. Stay as long as you want." And so that night, Carol cooked a big meal for them and they all sat down at the table. And at some point, Carol and Reggie talk about the sale of their house in South Carolina. And somehow it came up that they had made $99,000 in profit from this sale. And they were so happy about it because now they could really retire comfortably. And so as soon as they said that, Tiffany and Michael shot glances at each other because they knew they had to come back and rob them. The next morning, Carol and Reggie got up early, they made coffee and they made breakfast, and they were hoping that Tiffany and Michael would stick around for the day and spend some more time with them. But Tiffany and Michael were very quick to want to leave. They said, "Thank you very much, we got to hit the road." And so they left. And as soon as they get in the car, they start planning how they're going to come back and rob the Sumners and get their hands on that $99,000. 1 month later, on the evening of July 8th, after all robbery preparations have been made, Bruce Nixon and Alan Wade show up at the Sumner house and they knock on the door. When the door opens, it's Carol, and she doesn't recognize either of them, but being as kind and generous as she was, she said, "Hey boys, what can I do for you? How can I help you?" And this was exactly what Bruce and Alan were expecting based on what Tiffany told them. She said this couple would be very easy to exploit. And they tell her that their car had broken down and they needed to use her phone. And so she's a little bit skeptical, but ultimately she says, "Sure, come on in." And so Bruce and Alan go inside the house, the door door shuts behind them, and as soon as it does, one of them draws a fake gun that looks very real and pointed it at Carol, while the other one began tying her up with cord and with duct tape. And so Carol begins screaming and making a bunch of noise, and Reggie, who's in the garage out of sight, he hears her. He comes running in to see what's going on, and he sees these two men who immediately attack him, and Reggie's got a broken leg, and he's already pretty weak and frail, and so he doesn't put up much of a fight. And before long, he and his wife were all taped up and restrained on the couch, and they were having duct tape wrapped around their heads until everything was covered except for a slit underneath their nose so they could breathe. And so with the couple completely under control and at the mercy of their captors, one of the men texted Michael, who was down the road with Tiffany inside of Tiffany's rental car, and the text just said, "all clear." And what that meant was Michael could now come up and help them rob the house. And so Tiffany stays down the road in the rental car. Michael makes his way up. He goes inside, and he, Bruce, and Alan proceeded to ransack the house. And while these three men are moving room to room, taking all of their valuables, Reggie and Carol are probably thinking to themselves that, you know what, this is awful, we're getting robbed, but after they take whatever they take and they leave, we'll be fine, we'll recover. But when these three men finished taking all of their valuable items, they decided that they would also take Reggie and Carol. So they stood the couple up and they marched them into the garage and they put them in the trunk of their own car. At this point, Bruce left the Sumners house and went down the road and got in Tiffany's rental car, and Michael and Alan, they got into the Sumners car, and the two cars met up on the road and then drove 40 minutes northwest just over the border into Georgia, where they found this access road and they went down it until they reached this very secluded section of forest. This was not just some random spot in the middle of the woods in Georgia. This was a pre-selected spot that Tiffany and the others had been out to 2 days earlier to prepare it. And what they had done to prepare was to dig a grave for the Sumners. Michael and Alan in the Sumners car drove up right next to the grave site, while Tiffany and Bruce came up right behind them. And once they had all stopped, they got out of the car and they went right behind the Sumners car and they popped open the trunk. It's believed the temperature inside of that trunk was well over 100 degrees. And so Reggie and Carol were sweating profusely, and the sweat had caused their restraints to slip off their wrists and slip down off their face. And so the two of them were found holding on to each other and crying and praying. Seeing how weak they already were, the group decided they did not need to put new tape around their wrists or their face. They weren't going to go anywhere. And so they grabbed the two and they pulled them out and dumped them on the ground. It was probably around this time that the Sumners realized Tiffany was one of these four people that was doing this horrible thing to them. And I can only imagine the heartbreak they experienced. This girl that they took in under their wing, that they thought of as a daughter, was betraying them in such a heinous and horrible way. But there was no time to feel upset about it, because as soon as they were dumped on the ground, Michael grabbed Reggie and kind of threw him over to the side and said, "Sit down, don't move, or I'm going to kill you and your wife." And then the others grabbed Carol and dragged her away from her husband over to the edge of the grave, where they literally ripped the jewelry off of her face and off of her body. And then after all the jewelry was gone, they pushed her into the grave. Then they walked over to Reggie and dragged him over and threw him in with his wife. As soon as the couple was in the grave together, they repositioned themselves so they were both sitting up, one in front of the other, with Carol behind Reggie, and she threw her legs and her arms around Reggie, just kind of clutching onto him, and she buried her head into his back and she began crying. The original plan, apparently, had been to take the Sumners and put them in this grave and pretend like you were going to do something to them, to scare them into giving up all of their information, all of their banking information, and anything else that was valuable. And it worked. And so as Carol is crying into Reggie's back, Reggie is pleading with the group. He's pleading to them, "Let me give you everything I have. Whatever you need, it's yours." And so Michael said, "Give me all your ATM bank card numbers, give me your PIN numbers, everything." And so Reggie did. He gave him all the information he could possibly give to him. And then, for some reason, despite the fact that at this point, the group has taken everything of value from this poor couple. They have extracted all the valuable information they could possibly get from them. Despite that, they decide that that's not enough. They need to kill the Sumners. And they need to kill them in the worst way imaginable. They need to bury them alive. For hours, the group slowly, shovelful by shovelful, filled in this hole with Reggie and Carol sitting at the bottom begging for their lives. But the group didn't care at all. They just kept shoveling dirt down on top of them until the dirt and mud had gotten up to their necks, and the weight of the dirt was pressing in on their chests and was making it really hard to breathe. And so as Carol and Reggie are feeling this happening to them, they can feel themselves being crushed under this weight. Their cries for help become more and more desperate, but more spaced apart, because their breathing at this point is so labored, it's so hard to get a full breath that they're conserving their air at this point. And then at some point, as the dirt crept closer and closer to their mouths, they had to tilt their heads up to try to get a good breath of air. But when they did that, they began shoveling dirt directly onto their faces, causing them to choke and gag. They're inhaling this, and it's becoming nearly impossible to catch a breath. They're dying at this point. And so finally, another layer of dirt was thrown on top of them, and they disappeared under the soil. But their sounds didn't go away. They continued to whimper and make sounds as more and more dirt was put down, until finally they had filled in the hole, and they began packing the dirt down with the backs of their shovels. And they could hear underneath the soil still the sounds of this couple dying. This was a slow and horrible death. After the killers were done, they left the site and they took the Sumners' car and they dumped it in Florida, where it was ultimately found. And then they all piled into the rental car. They went to an ATM and pulled some of the Sumners' money out, and then went on a spending spree. Here is a photo of Tiffany celebrating just hours after killing the very people that had taken her in and treated her like a daughter. After their autopsies, the medical examiner explained that both Reggie and Carol had dirt packed into their nose, into their mouths, in their throats, in their stomach, and in their lungs, meaning their actual cause of death was being buried alive. In exchange for telling investigators what happened and for leading them to the gravesite where the Sumners were, Bruce Nixon was spared the death penalty and given a life sentence. As for Michael, Alan, and Tiffany, they were all sentenced to death. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp.
You just stay. Dad came home smelling like dust and rain. Heavy boots, heavier pain. Never talked much, never explained. Just made sure we ate, no matter the strain. Mom stayed up when the lights went low, counting hope in the things we owe. She smiled tired, said I'm okay, while carrying tomorrow on yesterday. I chased my dreams like they wait forever. Didn't see the cracks you held together. I thought love was loud, I was wrong. It was quiet, constant and strong. I said one day too many times, like time was patient, like love don't mind. I was busy chasing who I be.
And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go into the Like Button's favorite music playlist and replace all of the songs with the Kids Bop versions of them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also